floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir, the Honourable Prime Minister, Honourable Leader of the Opposition, and Honourable Ministers and Honourable Members of Parliament in Samuel Benak. Mr. Speaker, sir, I rise today in this August Parliament to lend my full support to the 2022-2023 National Budget. I would like to begin by congratulating the Honourable Attorney General and Minister for Economy and his team for safely steering our economy in the last 2 years under the most challenging of circumstances. Despite our worst economic crisis in history, driven by the global pandemic and the all-time high global inflation, this government has taken the economy from the depth of its worst crisis to its greatest year ever of record growth. Mr. Speaker, sir, unfortunately, many of the politicians on the other side, I'm using the word politicians, Mr. Speaker, sir, on the other side of this August chamber have continued to distort facts and reality without offering any alternatives to move the country forward. In my last Parliament contribution in the budget debate, I talked about the difference between politicians and true leaders, Mr. Speaker, sir. Because true leaders, they are focused about the good of the people and the future generation. Whereas politicians, it's all about winning elections, Mr. Speaker, sir. They must appreciate the fact that our journey towards economic recovery is progressing well, as clearly manifested in this new budget. Through their cynical observation and comments, they miss the enormous evidence of progress amidst the smokescreen of extremist propaganda and the confinement of short-term perspective. Mr. Speaker, sir, the accomplishment of the FijiFirst government under the visionary, strong and decisive leadership of Prime Minister Maritime will last, despite efforts by his critics and political opponents to extinguish them. Mr. Speaker, sir, we had promised the people of Fiji during the darkest days of the crisis that our economy would recover from the pandemic. It is through government's foresight and the decisive leadership by the Honourable Prime Minister that we are able to stabilize our economy through this period of economic challenges. Mr. Speaker, sir, despite the many uncertainties grappling our global economies today, government couched a compassionate, sensible and disciplined budget that provides the economic environment to support recovery and stability. This budget is projecting a future that can safeguard Fiji's economy despite the circumstances. However, Mr. Speaker, sir, our collective national efforts to rise above the impacts of the pandemic and the global inflation is continuously being challenged by the increasing misinformation to discredit our genuine efforts to support those in need. Mr. Speaker, sir, through this budget, the government has rolled out some powerful and necessary stimulus to support individuals and families suffering from this global inflation. This includes the removal of the VAT from 21 essential items, inflation mitigation package, which includes payout of about $180 per child in a 6-month period, $180 payout for all pensioners, $180 for all tertiary students, and a bus fare subsidy of 10% across the board. Mr. Speaker, sir, the budget before this chamber is a budget that helps us all and steers us to recovery and stability. Government has yet again put Fiji first in our 2022 and 2023 national budget by putting the needs of all Fijians first. Mr. Speaker, sir, my contribution on the bill before Parliament will be twofold. Speaking briefly on my portfolio responsibility as Minister for Rural and Maritime Development and Disaster Management, and later on as my portfolio responsibility as Minister responsible for Defence, National Security and Policing. But before I focus on the budget itself, Mr. Speaker, sir, let me just make a few comments here, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, the 2022-23 budget is a good budget, a budget for all Fijians. But unfortunately, partisan politics overtakes the greater good for most members of the opposition. I wish to acknowledge the contribution by the Honourable Aisha Rondo and the Honourable Naulu Matua, Mr. Speaker, sir. Very well balanced, and it's delivered out of sincerity and honesty, Mr. Speaker, sir. I wish to thank them and acknowledge them for their contribution. Unfortunately, for the leader of the National Federation Party, it's his worst budget address in the 7 years that I have heard him in this House, Mr. Speaker, sir. It's the worst address by the Honourable Leader, Mr. Speaker, sir, of the National Federation Party. I'm also concerned about some of the statements in this House, and I need to mention this as Minister responsible for national security, Mr. Speaker, sir. Let's not forget the fact that one of the most powerful and warring forces which drives indigenous ethno-nationalism in Fiji is Christian fundamentalism. And we need to keep reminded in this August House, Mr. Speaker, sir, because some are seeing themselves as spiritual guardians of indigenous rights, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, the Bible is clear. In Matthew 5:16, let your light shine before men, so that they see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. Let me go on to, it's a smoke screen, it's an election budget. Mr. Speaker, sir, government has been consistent all these years. And as I've stated, we are not worried about elections. We are worried about delivering for the people, Mr. Speaker, sir. Let me give you a few examples, Mr. Speaker, sir. Monasavu Dam was constructed way back in the 1980s. Monasavu Dam was constructed way back in the 80s, Mr. Speaker, sir. We've had elections after elections. We've had government after government. But electricity was not provided to the people of Naitasiri. Mr. Speaker, sir, under the Prime Minister and under the Bainimarama and the FijiFirst government, electricity is now in Naitasiri. We have electricity in the Upper Namosi. We have electricity in Ba. We have electricity in Ra. And we have electricity all over Fiji, Mr. Speaker, sir. It's not because of elections, but because people deserve it. People deserve it, Mr. Speaker, sir. They have been overlooked over the years. But, Mr. Speaker, sir, they deserve it. Infrastructure. The Honourable Rendronro mentioned and emphasized on the importance of infrastructure, because this is linked to economic development and progress. And this is something that we look forward to hear from the Honourable Professor. But unfortunately, he's talking about the two-man rule and... Mr. Speaker, sir, infrastructure is so important. We tahsiled the number Walu Ndreketi Road. Not because of elections, because it's needed and it's important for the economy and development, Mr. Speaker, sir. There is a look north policy, but investors wouldn't want to go to the north. They're talking about investment in the private sector. But there's lack of infrastructure in the northern division, Mr. Speaker, sir. In Nandronga, Mr. Speaker, sir, we tahsil the West Bank because of the agriculture that's within the Singatoka Valley, Mr. Speaker, sir. And so many others. We've built about 63 bridges, 63 out of the 153 that were identified during Honourable Tikundundu's days as Minister for Infrastructure. We've constructed 63 out of those bridges that have been identified, Mr. Speaker, sir. And that will continue. And yet they talk about the debt, Mr. Speaker, sir. Logic and common sense will tell us that we will just do maintenance on the number Walu Ndreketi Road. And we will also look at maintaining all the other bridges that we have constructed, Mr. Speaker, sir. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition is now saying that there is lesser allocation for capital expenses. That's logical, Mr. Speaker, sir, because we are doing most of the work now. And when you talk that and relate that to the debt level, in the years to come, there will be less of our commitment into the capital expenses because we are now investing in the infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, sir. And on that note, Mr. Speaker, sir, if we look at previous budgets by previous governments, when you look at the ratio between capital expenses and operational expenses, it was on an 80 to 20% ratio, Mr. Speaker, sir. 80% on operational expenses, 20% on capital expenses. We changed that, Mr. Speaker, sir. 60% operational, 40% capital, Mr. Speaker, sir. And that is why you see most of the investments now happening throughout Fiji, Mr. Speaker, sir. Community access roads. We are continuing to build community access roads. Honorable Rasova, you go now to Kandabu, we are linking Kavala to Vunisea. Something that has never been done before. Now the road is in Nangalotu. And there we will take it to Toava and then to Lomati, and then we will link it up from Davingele, Mr. Speaker, sir. We have cut the road now to the last village in Namosi, Wainilotulevu. Right now we are linking Ra province with Naitasiri, Mr. Speaker, sir, cutting the road to Roma. We are also planning to link the road between Namosi and Naitasiri, from Wainimakutu to Nasaba, Mr. Speaker, sir. There are plans. I don't know whether the Honorable Chesaselkuru has been visiting rural Fiji, and the one next to him as well, Mr. Speaker, sir. Where are they getting their information from? Rural Fiji now is thriving, Mr. Speaker, sir, because government has invested heavily in infrastructure in the rural area, Mr. Speaker, sir. When it talks about decentralization of services, let me highlight this. Decentralization of services. This government, not driven by elections, have constructed a government station in Kabala, in Kandabu. We have also constructed a DO station in Nassau, in Koro. We have also constructed a DO station in Garani, in Ngau, in Danda, in Namosi, in Wanikoro, in Maduata, in Kumbulau, in Bua, in Lekutu, in Bua, in Namarai, in Ra, you name it. Not because of elections. That's part of the civil service reform, decentralization and empowerment of our people, because they deserve it, Mr. Speaker, sir. It's not about elections. It's not about elections, Mr. Speaker, sir. And that is why the Honorable Leader of the NFP is so worried. He is strategically paralyzed, Mr. Speaker, sir. Yeah. Because he's just dusting cobwebs and he's sleeping in well with the leader of People Alliance. But let's kill the spider, Mr. Speaker, sir. Let me tell the Honorable Leader of the NFP, the people know the Honorable Prime Minister. The people know the Honorable Leader of Sudelpa. They also know the Honorable Leader of NFP. We don't have to talk a lot to them, because our deeds, our actions have speak for itself and have proven our record as well, Mr. Speaker, sir. I can go on with the list, but let me go to my ministries very quickly, and then I'll come back to some of the issues. Rural development and disaster management. This budget supports government's aspirations to build stronger and more vibrant rural and maritime communities. Mr. Speaker, sir, they keep quoting about this highest report. I, for one, that follow rural development very closely, am surprised, but not surprised because things have changed, but it's because of the return in investment that government has done over the years. The Honorable Wanganiga probably talked about the 29% reduction to 21% poverty. But did she realize what the incidence of poverty in Fiji was a few years back? When I was Commissioner Northern, incidence of poverty in Vanuatu was 53%. In that highest report that they are quoting, Mr. Speaker, sir, what is surprising compared to the previous report, I know this very well, Mr. Speaker, sir. In the previous report before the 1920, Mr. Speaker, sir, rural poverty increased, except Vanuatu. Urban poverty decreased. But in this recent highest report, Mr. Speaker, sir, urban poverty in all the regions, in the east, in the west, in the central, in the north, they all decreased, Mr. Speaker, sir. That is because of the level of investment, not because of politics, not because of elections, but the people deserve it. And we will reap the rewards in the years to come, Mr. Speaker, sir. Again, government through this budget has allocated 15 million to FRA, towards connecting our rural inaccessible communities to economic centers and key public services, Mr. Speaker, sir. It's encouraging to note that funding has been set aside to upgrade the Langi to Tawake Village Road and to construct a new road from Tawake to Wenika, near Untu Point in Vanuatu. I wish to remind the Honourable Naburelewu as well that we have already started the road to Baloboni that he has been telling us, Mr. Speaker, sir. And we are also, for your information, we are also considering cutting a road from Neyarambale to Baloboni, which is a better option rather than going through Nasasa in Maduata, Mr. Speaker, sir. So it's all in place, Mr. Speaker, sir. I wish to lend my support and appreciation on the plan to commence a pre-feasibility study in the construction of Vitilevu cross-country highway, as of course supported by the Honourable Randrono as well. Mr. Speaker, sir, I wish to thank government as well for the provision of 19.3 million to EFL towards the rural grid extension and housing wiring works. And of course, the Honourable Minister has talked about the solar systems, Mr. Speaker, sir. Let me also say that this budget funding will provide $4.9 million allocated for rural water supply, Mr. Speaker, sir. I was in Teilevu last week in Sawa Village, and next week the Minister will also be traveling to Nasembitu in Wenimbuka. These are some of the projects that will improve rural water and rural sanitation, Mr. Speaker, sir. On government shipping services, the allocation of 3.4 million, which will subsidize and continue to cushion the impacts of rising fuel costs and ensure business continuity for vessel operators that service the uneconomical routes under the franchise scheme. The Honourable Naul Matua talked about digital infrastructure in Fiji, Mr. Speaker, sir. And I wish to commend the Ministry of Economy again for allocating funds for the construction of the 240 unconnected and poorly connected areas, and the proposal for the financial year is to construct the first 15 towers to connect at least 96 out of the unconnected or poorly connected areas, which will be a big boost to the rural economies in connecting Fijians locally and abroad. Mr. Speaker, sir, in order to ensure that the rate of return on government investment in rural infrastructure is realized, government through this budget will continue to invest in the agriculture sector through the farm mechanization, and the Minister has already talked about that, Mr. Speaker, sir. Let me go to the Ministry of Defence very quickly. I wish to focus my address on the Ministry of Defence, National Security and Policing. The Ministry provides leadership over Fiji's national security efforts through the formulation and effective implementation of policies, legislations, programs and initiatives related to maintaining and enhancing Fiji's security and defence, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, as we all know, the strategic threat environment through comprehensive analysis by regional defence coordinating groups has been viewed to evolve rapidly and intensify the complex regional security dynamics. The diverse threats faced in the region inclusively captures both traditional and non-traditional security threats, which position the region to be more vulnerable and susceptible to both traditional and non-traditional security threats, Mr. Speaker, sir. I wish to again acknowledge the allocation given to the ministry. In fact, Mr. Speaker, sir, increased by 3.23% with a total allocation of 14.9 million. And I'm also thankful because as Minister responsible for veteran affairs, I do acknowledge the allocation of 12.4 million to the Aftercare Fund Office, Mr. Speaker. Sir. Again, this is not about elections, honourable members, but this is the government that remembered our veterans that went to the Christmas Islands, Mr. Speaker. Sir. Government after government, elections after elections, no one addressed that issue, Mr. Speaker, sir. This is the same government that increased the allocation to the Turangani Chorus and the maternity clinics and the advisory councillors and the village nurses, Mr. Speaker, sir. And of course, increased allowance for our peacekeeping troops, Mr. Speaker, sir. That is what this government is doing. On the Republic of Fiji military forces, there has been some comments on it, Mr. Speaker, sir. Again, they deserve the increase, particularly for the 5 million increase in the operating budget and the 1.9 million increase in capital budget, resulting in the increase of 0.2 million. And of course, again, the allocation that has been given for their capital works, and most importantly, to subsidize the pay rates as from 2013 involving lodging allowance and service allowance, Mr. Speaker, sir. I will not go into the details, but I do acknowledge the work of the Commissioner of Police in his restructure as well, Mr. Speaker, sir, that we'll see that the police reform will continue, and of course, that will mean better security for our people, Mr. Speaker, sir. Overall, I do support the 2022 and the 2023 national budget, a budget for the people by a government that cares for all Fijians, Mr. Speaker, sir, and I have no hesitation to, and again, reiterate my support for the